morning sun stretched across the Nebraska prairie like butter melting on warm toast, and Samuel Hartwell stood at his kitchen window, watching the light dance across the grasslands that had been his home for 43 years now. He had risen, early as was his way, and the coffee was already brewing when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the usual symphony of morning birds and rustling wheat. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, but persistent enough to draw him outside. Samuel pulled on his worn leather boots and stepped onto the porch that sagged just slightly on the left side where the wood had settled over the decades. The sound came again clearer now, and unmistakably human. Someone was calling out, but the voice was weak, strained with what sounded like pain or exhaustion. Samuel's weathered hands found the brim of his hat as he squinted toward the eastern pasture, where the sound seemed to originate. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts. About such things in 43 years of ranching, a man develops a sixth sense about when something isn't right. He walked to the barn with measured steps, his boots crunching softly on the dry grass. Inside Belle, his chestnut mare nickered softly, as if sensing his urgency. She was getting on in years like himself, but she still had spirit, and more importantly, she had judgment. Belle had an uncanny ability to navigate difficult terrain, and more than once her careful stepping had kept them both from harm. Samuel saddled her quickly but thoroughly. Haste in the saddle could lead to trouble, and trouble on the prairie was often the kind that couldn't be undone. As they rode toward the eastern boundary of his land, the calling grew stronger, and Samuel felt his chest tighten with concern. The voice belonged to a woman, and she sounded desperate. When they crested the small rise near Willow Creek, Samuel saw her. A young woman, perhaps 30 years old, was seated on what appeared to be an overturned wagon wheel. Her pale blue dress was torn and stained with what looked like dried blood, and her dark hair had come loose from whatever arrangement she had started the day with. But it was her eyes that struck Samuel most. They held a mixture of fear, relief, and something else he couldn't quite place. Something that spoke of deeper wounds than the obvious physical ones as he approached. She looked up at him with the expression that seemed to ask for permission to hope. "Please," she said, and her voice cracked like autumn leaves. "I don't want to die out here alone." Samuel dismounted slowly, keeping his movements gentle and non-threatening. Years of working with skittish horses had taught him that sudden movements could send a frightened creature running. "You're not going to die," he said simply, "and you're certainly not alone now." He knelt beside her and could see that her left arm was cradled against her body at an unnatural angle. There were scrapes along her legs and a particularly nasty cut on her forehead that had bled considerably but appeared to have stopped. "My name is Samuel Hartwell," he said. "This is my land, and you're safe here." The woman's shoulders began to shake, and Samuel realized she was crying. Not the dramatic sobbing of someone seeking attention, but the quiet tears of someone who had been holding fear and pain inside for too long. "I'm Margaret," she whispered. "Margaret Patterson." "Well, Miss Patterson," Samuel said, "let's get you someplace where we can tend to those injuries properly." He helped her onto Belle with infinite care, supporting her weight as she struggled to mount. Margaret winced but didn't cry out, and Samuel found himself admiring her stoicism. The ride back to the house was slow and careful, with Samuel walking alongside Belle and keeping a steadying hand near Margaret's good arm. When they reached the house, Samuel helped Margaret down and guided her to the kitchen, where the morning light was brightest. "Sit there," he said, indicating a sturdy wooden chair, "and let me take a look at what we're dealing with." Margaret eased herself into the chair, and Samuel could see the effort it cost her. He filled a basin with warm water from the stove and gathered clean cloths from the pantry. "I should warn you," he said gently. "I'm no doctor, but I've patched up my share of cuts and scrapes over the years." "I trust you," Margaret said, and there was something in her voice that made Samuel pause. It wasn't just gratitude. It was the voice of someone who had learned to be grateful for simple human kindness. As Samuel began to clean the cut on her forehead, Margaret began to talk. Her voice was soft but steady, as if she needed to let the words out before they poisoned her from the inside. "I was traveling to Denver," she said, "to meet a man I was supposed to marry." Samuel continued his gentle ministrations but listened carefully. A man I had never met, she continued, arranged by my father who thought it would be advantageous for our family's business interests. The cut was deeper than Samuel had initially thought, but it was clean and would heal well with proper care. The wagon wheel broke yesterday afternoon, Margaret said, and the driver. Well, he said it would be easier to continue without the burden of a passenger. Samuel's hand stilled for a moment. He left you, he said, and it wasn't a question, with my trunk and my injuries, and told me that Denver was only 20 miles northeast. Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. I've been walking since yesterday evening. Samuel resumed his work, his jaw tight with controlled anger. Not at Margaret, but at the kind of people who would abandon an injured woman in the middle of nowhere. I kept thinking someone would come along, Margaret said, but when the sun started to set and I realized I might have to spend the night out there alone, I started to panic. Samuel applied a clean bandage to the cut and moved on to examining her arm. This is going to hurt, he warned, but I need to see if it's broken. Margaret nodded and bit her lip as Samuel gently probed the injury. It's not broken, he said after a moment, but it's badly sprained and you've got some impressive bruising. He fashioned a sling from a clean dish towel and helped Margaret get her arm positioned comfortably. There, he said, that should help. Margaret looked down at the makeshift sling and then up at Samuel. Why are you helping me? She asked. The question caught Samuel off guard. What? Do you mean you don't know me? Margaret said, I could be anyone. Samuel poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Margaret. You could be, he agreed. But you're not? How can you be so sure? Samuel sat down across from her and considered his words carefully. 43 years ago, he said. I came out here with nothing but a wagon load of supplies and a head full of dreams about making something of myself. He took a sip of his coffee and gazed out the window at the prairie. First, winter nearly killed me. He continued. I'd built the cabin, but I hadn't prepared nearly enough firewood, and when the blizzards came, I thought I was done for. Margaret listened intently, as if sensing that this story was important. One morning, I woke up and there was smoke coming from my chimney. Samuel said, I stumbled outside and there was an old Lakota man sitting by my fire. What did he do? He saved my life. Samuel said simply, stayed with me for 3 days while the storm raged, and when it was over, he helped me cut enough wood to last the rest of the winter. Samuel's eyes grew distant with memory. I tried to thank him, tried to offer him something in return, but he just smiled and said that kindness given freely comes back, tenfold. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. And you believe that? I've lived it, Samuel said. Every act of kindness I've received over the years and everyone I've given has proven that old man right. Margaret's eyes filled with tears again. Was so frightened, she whispered. Not just of dying out there, but of everything. Of marrying a stranger. Margaret nodded. Of leaving everything I knew behind, of never having a choice in what happened to my own life. Samuel reached across the table and patted her uninjured hand gently. Sometimes, he said, what feels like the worst thing that could happen turns out to be exactly what needed to happen. Margaret looked at him questioningly. That broken wagon wheel. Samuel explained. It might have saved you from something much worse than a night on the prairie. But now I have nowhere to go, Margaret said. No money for another wagon, no way to continue to Denver. Do you want to go to Denver? Samuel asked. Margaret considered the question. Carefully, no, she said finally. I don't think I do. Then don't. It can't be that simple. Samuel smiled, the first real smile Margaret had seen from him. It can be exactly that simple. He said, you're a grown woman, and you have choices, even if they don't feel like the choices you expected to have. Over the next several days, Margaret's physical injuries began to heal, but more importantly, her spirit began to recover as well. Samuel had insisted she stay in the small guest room until she was fully recovered, and Margaret had gratefully accepted. She found herself helping with small tasks around the house, cooking and mending and organizing. It felt good to be useful, and she discovered she had a talent for making the simple cabin feel more like a home. Samuel was quiet by nature, but Margaret learned to read the subtle signs of his mood and his needs. When he came in tired from working with the cattle, she would have coffee ready. When he sat on the porch in the evenings, she would join him, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. One evening, about a week after her arrival, Margaret found Samuel on the porch, staring at the sunset. "I've been thinking," she said as she settled into the chair beside him. "About what?" "About staying." Samuel turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "Here," she continued. "I mean, if you would have me." "What would people say?" Samuel asked. "A unmarried woman living with a bachelor rancher." Margaret had been XP